Welcome to The Edge of Leadership with Michael Molinaro and Greg Thompson, a podcast series featuring conversations with fanatical outliers, unapologetic contrarians, and passionate zealots that will challenge you to rethink your most closely held beliefs about leadership and its role in today's complex organizations. And now, Michael and Greg.
Hi, this is Greg Thompson, and welcome to the Edge of Leadership podcast. In this episode, Michael and I and our two guests are going to explore the fascinating field of organization development education. Joining us today are two academic OD leaders who represent seemingly opposite ends of the OD education spectrum. Gary Mangiofico is the academic chair and director of the Pepperdine's Master of Organization Development program, commonly known as MSOD. Chris Crosby is leading the rebirth and rebuild of LEOS, the Leadership Institute of Seattle. Michael, before we speak further to our guests, there's one question I've always wanted to ask you. I've known you for 15 years. You've been in the business for 30. Do you consider yourself an OD practitioner?
Hey, Greg, nice to see you again. It's a great question. I see myself as somebody who has to use OD tools, deploy OD skills. As a chief learning officer of a large financial services company, and I have responsibility for some OD work that takes place in the organization. I leave the hardcore OD work up to people on my team who do this and are trained as, organizational psychologists or have OD backgrounds, such as yourself. I see OD as kind of part of the toolkit that I've got to be able to use, but certainly there are things from a diagnostic and engagement and facilitation, group process practice, I think come right out of, OD textbooks that you guys are all have developed, I guess. But I don't describe myself at cocktail parties as an OD person. First of all, no one knows what that is. When people ask me what I do for a living, I say I run learning for a Fortune 100 company. So no, but I'd love to hear more about, maybe I am, and maybe I'm just selling myself short a bit. I want to hear more about what Gary and Chris have to say about that. And why don't we, I'd love to dive right in and have Chris and Gary just start, if you would, and with kind of a quick introduction to yourselves. Chris, do you mind?
No, hi, I'm Chris Crosby. It's an honor to be here. I'm the president of the Leadership Institute of Seattle. And I've been in the field that I would call organization development since 1993. Got my degrees from the same organization that I'm trying to restart, the Leadership Institute of Seattle, and then went internal for 8 years at Alcoa. 4 years doing what I call pure OD, and 4 years helping implement an Oracle software through. It was a global implementation. I don't know, about 30 locations. Eight or so countries over 4 years, and proudly we used clarity of authority, which is a core OD concept, and really made sure that all the end users were engaged, and ended up missing 0 shipments over 4 years, and mostly the employees were happy, which for an IT implementation, that's important. Since then, I've been external, and about 6 years ago, I took on the role of the president of the Pacific Northwest Organization Development Network. And that's where along the way I met Gary. It's an honor to be here with you, Gary. And then halfway through that, I realized that I wanted to restart LEOS, which had ended at Saybrook University. And so Mike Mulholland, proud Pepperdine MSOD graduate, came to me and said, I want to help you restart LEOS. He's a retired Boeing OD guy. And so we spent the last few years doing that. Not sure what else.
No, that's great, Chris. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's terrific.
Yeah.
Gary, do you mind?
No, happy to share a little bit. And thanks for the invitation today. Also honored to be here. My practice of OD probably goes back to the early 1980s. It was often referred to as professional services within corporate environments at that time. And I in particularly was practicing in the area of healthcare. Did that for probably close to a decade with a lot of the early, influenced by a lot of the early founders and folks back in the 80s. And then in the 90s, actually moved into executive roles, managing various healthcare entities and organizations, and as well as healthcare consulting services within a Fortune 50 corporation. And was fortunate enough to take early retirement, at which time I decided to dip my toe into academia, and was brought in to Pepperdine University's MSOD program, and have been there nearly 20 years now. And during that time, I've been the academic director for about 8 of those years, as well as having overseen the program while I was associate dean as well. So I'm kind of a practitioner scholar, and is how I guess I would describe myself. I'm also in the program, both the academic director as well as the chair of the faculty committee for MSOD, with a lot of names I'm sure would be familiar to your listeners here. And as well as met Chris while I was president and chair of ODN, which I had the honor to be elected 3 times to serve in that capacity. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you both. Gary, let's stay with you for a minute. And then Chris, go to you for the same question. How do you both think what's the current state of OD, both as a field, as an area of study, and as a place as a practice, and which is rooted inside organizations? What's the current state of it? Do you see it growing? Is its influence waning? Are the core capabilities? Is there new research being funded? Is there an interest in kind of the core capabilities that OD deploys into organizations as still being important and relative in organizations today? Gary, I'll let you start.
Yeah, great question. It's interesting for a field that's been around for several decades. I'd say it's really in itself a developmental stage, in the sense that there's a lot of tension within the field about where to focus and how to further develop ourselves. I think the state of OD, as it were, is you have to be grounded in foundational work, but I don't think that's enough anymore. I think companies are increasingly facing very volatile environments, very dynamic, rapidly shifting circumstances, and the demand for OD practitioners is to be much more flexible and capable of shifting and being what I would call the ability to practice complex responsiveness to emerging dynamics in organizations. So yes, I still think there's a call and a need for it, but I think there's an ask for us to evolve and be much more dynamic and not just rely on historical models. In terms of its demand, I guess the thing I'd say, and then I'll turn it over to Chris, is that according to the World Economic Forum, OD continues to be in the top 20 of professions that are seen as projected to grow, even with the evolution of technology, actually even probably more so as we move into the fourth industrial revolution, because these are things that are largely structural and transactional, and the need to elevate the human side of the enterprise in light of all that rapid development and technological change is seen as more pressing than ever. So I think high demand, but a need to evolve.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thought, Chris, I want to get to you in a second. There's an interesting notion embedded in what you've said there, which is how OD gets deployed in organizations, and whether there's appetite for some of the academic approaches that come out of schools and how those get adopted in organizations. And I'd love to get your thoughts, Gary, in particular, about how you feel when that happens, and sort of the contextual application for what you teach your students. Chris, your thoughts on kind of the state of OD at the moment?
Well, I think that's a difficult question, actually. I believe that there's always been a tension between what is historical OD and what isn't, and I believe it's been twisted a bit over the years. And OD gets a little confused with HR in organizations. I listened to a brilliant speech a few years ago at the OD National Conference, and the speaker said that OD's needed more today than ever. The guy was named Gary. Anyways, so I believe that really OD is very much needed, but I think too many people are trained in more like a Big Five consulting kind of way, and so they want to go in and give people answers instead of tried and true OD, which came out of World War II, was solving big, complex, complicated problems that was needed in order for us to win the war, for instance. Those methods were process consulting. The OD professional helps the different people come up with their own solutions, look at all the complex scenarios, and develop ways to solve those scenarios. So for me, OD and its tried and true principles, way they were intended, is actually the medicine we need. But there's a movement in the field to find the newest, latest thing, and people forget the grounding and the foundational work that was done.
Yeah, Greg, I bet that's one of the things that attracted you, the process consulting side. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. My training prior to Pepperdine was as an engineer. And so what I found from myself personally transformative is as an engineer, and I'm a design engineer, we design things to last. And we try to design things to last forever and for as long as possible. And the one thing that really was a big shift for me in OD is this whole idea of self-renewal. Like that was not my job anymore. My job now was to help systems, organizations, teams, people be self-renewing, to have that capacity for self-renewal. So it, actually, quite frankly, I found it bizarre as a young engineer to even encounter that concept. May I, if I could ask both of you, this is a kind of a foundational question for me, for you as educators. Like, what are your graduates doing? Like, when they graduate, what are they doing? And here's the background for me: is, as I'd mentioned in some of our pre-conversations, is that we've hired my company Blue Point hired a number of grads from both your schools, and we hire them because they make great coaches and they make great facilitators. But we do not hire them as OD specialists. It's just not our field. We believe that they do excellent work as facilitators and as coaches. But my expectation would be that the majority of your graduates would move into that more pure organizational development role. Am I correct or not correct?
I'm not sure who you're asking.
Both. You start, Gary. I mean, I'm for MSOD, most of you, do your graduates end up doing what I would consider to be contemporary, pure organization development work, intervention, consulting? Or do they end up in an HR role, a training role, a facilitation role, a coaching role?
I think there are probably about three major categories that I would see our graduates going into. Still, the large majority go into more traditional OD practice. Over half of our grads end up developing their own practice or joining forces with others and having a very active OD practice. Now, what they focus on can range quite significantly, but they are doing the kind of consultative, process consulting, transformative work that we would normally think of in terms of OD. A second group are really kind of internal OD consultants that might find themselves having to deal with more variety of work beyond conventional OD or what might be called classical OD. And in part, that's sort of the success of OD, is that it's the skills, regardless of how you define what classic OD is or not, are seen as very valuable within organizations. So we're seeing a lot of our folks either evolve with strategy or strategy business partners with the HR and operations, kind of bridging that, even going into things like training and development, learning and development, but doing it with an OD lens or OD view towards the way they're approaching that work. And then kind of the third category is the sort of manager or executive who has to lead change or transformation within organizations and wants to do it in a way that they think will be sustainable and more effective. And so they're returning and becoming sort of the OD informed, if you will, kind of managerial executive. Now, within that, I think, again, there's a range of practice. We see lots of people go into coaching, especially early on in their career, because it has an easier access than more classical OD, which requires a deeper, perhaps, level of experience and time to build the repertoire necessary to do, large-scale OD work. So we see a range, but I'd say those are the three basic categories.
Chris, your thoughts?
It's funny you said coaching, Gary. When I went through my master's program, coaching didn't even exist, and it has certainly exploded now. And so it is an easy way to go in and just sort of help people. Over the years, Leo's, since '81, they had developed a counseling track. So, more than half the graduates since then became counselors because they were trained counselors. And then the OD side of things was called various different things at times. And I would say in the Seattle program, most probably went into more traditional OD, and a few went into leadership. A few of the counselors morphed into OD, traditional OD, or various means. But certainly we've always ascribed to teach process consulting style OD. Now however, there was a corporate graduate program, and that's the program that I am using to base the restart of Leo's on. That was led by Robert Crosby, my father, who was a ODN National Award winner in 2018. I think right before Gary, you were leading that organization. 2016 was the year. Anyways, so of the corporate graduate students, most of those people just excelled in whatever role they were in and ended up becoming CEOs or higher level leaders. And so really, that's what we're aiming for. We want leaders to come in and learn how to manage change and excel in whatever organizations they're in. And, my hint is that every manager has to manage change, even if you don't think you have to. So just recently, the last certificate program, right before Leo's became what we modeled on, of the 11 people, 9 of them got promoted right away. So they're just going into higher level leaderships. But a few of those people want to learn how to do the kind of OD work that we teach.
Good,
Chris,
you both.
earlier on, you talked a little bit about the roots of OD being founded in organizational process design. And it's got me thinking about how far some of the things you and Gary have just been talking about have moved from that. Coaching being, a much more individual dialogic process that's got maybe a little bit to do with how roles are constructed, but not a lot with org systems design. And have things like, well, let me ask, what's taken the field away from where it started? I can imagine there's all kinds of new research, in the social psychology spaces. And there are things like, golly, even when I was starting in the 80s, things like, organizational systems design and socio-technical and all this kinds of org modeling work, which were putting some pressure on what was pure OD practice to be different. And now, it's got this, there's a little bit of woo in OD work that everybody wants to exploit to some degree. Do you know what I mean? Has it moved so far from its roots that it's difficult to even pin down what we're talking about?
Are you asking me that, Michael?
Yeah, Chris, yeah.
One of the things I really loved about being the president of Pacific Northwest Organization Development Network is that, and I'm sure, Gary, you could see this in your role, I think it's hard to pin down OD as one thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to honor that there's a lot of different ways to practice and a lot of different things that are really useful and important. And even if I'm doing a traditional HR role, if I can have a better systemic lens, then that's really important, and it helps any organization. But for me, clarity of authority, group process, working with the intact group, the boss and employees together, helping the system see across each other, helping the right people link, doing process work, helping work through difficult scenarios. That's the traditional OD that I and Leo's ascribes to teach people. We want leaders that can handle conflict, that can be calm and presence, that understand each moment is the only moment and can be here and hang with people and just work through what is, but always with the frame of how am I going to help this business move the needle towards better business results while increasing and developing. It's got to be both to be organization development in my book.
Yeah.
Gary, I'd love to hear, Gary, what you think, because you run an academic program around preparing OD professionals. Do you feel pressure to widen what that means?
Well, I'm not sure I feel pressure in as so much as I think it's critical for the field's survival. When we think about historical OD and sort of the ground core values or basis and so forth, I don't think that has tremendously changed. But what I do think has changed is the context in which organizations are operating and in which people are living their professional lives, if you will. And I kind of liken it to, say, the field of psychology, right? The field of psychology still holds true to some of the original values of dealing effectively with one's mental health and so on and so forth, things that are still valuable today. But if the field itself didn't learn from itself, then it would never have evolved, and we'd still be studying Freudian toilet training as opposed to more advanced, neurological, concomitants to mental health. So, I think OD, needs to be cautious that it doesn't reify its history to the point it doesn't allow itself to do the very thing it teaches, which is to engage in transformation that increases effectiveness. So I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing about the field is that while systems theory is the dominant and prevailing metaphor, and certainly the basis of a lot of the historical work, that one of the challenges is that conventional systems as they were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when a lot of the models were developed, are no longer operating that way. They're in much more radical environments, much more global environments, much more dynamic environments. And so I think, again, it doesn't eliminate or minimize the need for some of the conventional work and the ability to do diagnostic work. In fact, I think that's critical. But it also may mean that we not reify the organization to the point that we miss the dynamics of a larger ecosystem or eco-environment that is ever shifting. And so consequently, if the context shifts, the practice work has to shift. And I think that's what research is beginning to teach us, as well as actual practice itself.
Gary, in my 2 years as a student in the MSAD program, this is one question I've always wanted to ask. I've never asked it before. Is it in those 2 years, never once was money mentioned. Very rarely was profit mentioned. And I found it fascinating. I never thought about it until the very end. I mean, we talked about organization effectiveness and then by extension, organization success and financial success. You would think about that. But I guess I've always had this sense that at least we need to be cautious as people who at least subscribe to OD principles, that we don't see ourselves coming from a higher moral plane than our clients. Most of my clients, all of my clients, making money is a big, big deal for them. And it is how they measure themselves, how they keep the organization alive, how they provide great jobs for people, etc. and they're not unabashed about talking about money. We don't talk much about money in OD.
Right. Well, I think because OD is not restricted just to the for-profit environment, right? It can go into NGOs, government, nonprofits, etc. And I think OD has a calling or kind of a moral compass that focuses on certain values that, again, I frame as sort of elevating the human side of the enterprise. There's other systems to elevate the financial side or the governance side, et cetera. But I think effectiveness is defined by the client, right? The organization. So if in fact profitability becomes an issue, I think OD doesn't focus on profitability in so much as it focuses on effectiveness. And if the right assessment and diagnostics are applied, the strategy is developed and is core to the organizational design and development and so forth, then the organization should be able to achieve its goals, whatever they are. And for the for-profits, that's going to include profit. And for nonprofits, that's going to include enough of a margin that they can reinvest in themselves to continue going. So I think the life of the organization is not predicated just on finances. I think that economic model has more to do with first of all, macroeconomics, and it also has to do with the law. In the United States, the number one obligation of a for-profit company is a return on investment for shareholders. So that's something they're legally bound to do. But I think OD has the ability to go beyond that view and say, what is really your aspiration? And then how do we effectively facilitate your organization design, et cetera, in such a way that you're able to accomplish what it is you set out to accomplish?
Good. Thank you for that.
I'd like to weigh in on this one. It's important to me. To me, there's always been a movement in the OD field that is sociocentric and wants development and health over profit or making money. And so I think that's a tension that's there. And I want to make sure that we're helping people understand the importance of numeric metrics and measurable goals while developing people. And so the sort of one of the geniuses of Robert Crosby is that he helped people gain great business results and develop at the same time. So for me, it has to be both. There has to be going after business goals and developing people at the same time in the context of the direction of the organization, so that more people get hired, more people get honored, people don't lose their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't matter to me whether it's for profit or nonprofit. Everybody has to make a certain amount of money, or it hurts the employees.
So, Chris, while I have you, I'm keenly interested as to why. I mean, there's outstanding organization development schools in the U.S. and internationally today, including Pepperdine. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you rebuilding, renewing, rejuvenating LEOS?
Well, thank you. Over the last several years, a lot of OD schools have died, and like American University, like Leo's, and so I think, in my belief, Leo's is so unique because it's built on the T group. It's built on traditional OD, but it's built on a certain version that does what I just talked about, combines development with also measurable goals. I think businesses need it. I think the ironic thing for me is that every manager has to lead a group of people, yet traditional education is taught in a classroom way. So there's no group learning, hardly any group learning in it. So the Leadership Institute of Seattle is built on T group. The first week is just a T group. The rest of the time has a lot of T group mixed in, and it's a particular brand of T group created by Robert Crosby, Ron Short, John Scher, that is adapted to industry. So we do it often in industry, and a lot of T groups you just can't take into industry. And So how do you teach leaders to lead groups? I don't think you can do it if it's not in the context of group process. I know Pepperdine is, heavy into group learning. And so it's needed. That's why.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, I know we're coming up for time. I had one. I'd love to hear from both Chris and Gary where they would like to see the field of OD focus more attention that it isn't today. When you look at the research agendas that potentially the field could have in front of you, where do you think the efforts should go? Chris?
Yeah,
Gary, go ahead.
yeah, it's a great question. I think increasingly the field has to be willing to look at increasing utilization of frameworks like social construction, sense making, and the ability to incorporate complexity perspectives and chaos perspectives that reflect kind of the VUCA world that you hear so many people use that term, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's just a reality of today's organizations. With information at fingertips, people form ideas and thoughts and innovations constantly. And so the ability to be responsive in the midst of those complex dynamics, I think, is where OD needs to continue to evolve. And it's part of where we're spending our time. I mean, we do the conventional work, we do the traditional self as instrument, group process work, basic foundational diagnostic assessment work, systems theory, et cetera. But I think then we've also got to push ourselves like we're doing to go beyond that, to look at how is co-creation a core element of the ability to actually create sustainable change and transformation? How do you look at social innovation as a beneficiary of OD competency and so forth? How do you look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as an element that's critical to elevating the human side of the enterprise, again, for organizations? So I think OD needs to expand beyond its fundamental core capabilities to look at the more complex world in which organizations are operating, even if you're doing individual OD-informed work like coaching, because that executive or person that you might be working with isn't operating in isolation, and because they operate within a context that is potentially shifting a great deal, I think we need to develop processes that help us and help them deal with emerging dynamics. And I think that's critical. The other element I'll say is that I think one of the ways we found to do this is increasingly to incorporate a global perspective. So our students spend the second year of their training outside of the US in different countries, so that we developed not just cultural competency, but multicultural perspectives and the ability to look at organizations, look at people from kind of multiple angles and dynamics, so that we're working with mental models that go beyond just the ones that are more, again, conventional or traditional here. And I think that that's going to increase in demand. We find, for example, Chris mentioned that a lot of schools have been going out of business for a variety of reasons, but I don't think demand is the issue. We continue to have the top level or top line of interest expressed in our program year after year after year. Now, COVID certainly disrupted our enrollment, but it didn't disrupt our expressed interest. And so I think people are looking for the ability to, again, learn the foundation fundamentals, but to go beyond that and look to create practices and skills and capacities that or capabilities that respond to, again, the sort of ever-changing dynamic of life.
Wonderful, thank you. We are coming to the close of our time together, and on behalf of Michael and John, this has been a tremendous conversation, and we thank both of you. Are there any final comments, Gary, you and or Chris would like to make?
Chris? Go ahead.
Well, I just on the last thing, I think there is no better way to learn about self than in a T group, in my beliefs, and it's learning by doing, which is the foundations of Kurt Lewin and John Dewey, which is really the basis of the Leo's graduate position. How does one co-create? I just recently was working in an organization, and they basically blame the employees for not showing up for work. And I asked them to consider that they're doing something that's creating a situation where those employees would rather not come in. And that was pretty hard for them to even consider. So, but how does one get into that co-creation stage that Gary was talking about? Is really important. And so I don't know how you do that unless you're really doing a heck of a lot of experiential learning. And that's really the basis of Leo's. I know it's the basis of Pepperdine as well, but beyond that, just thanks so much. This has been fun, and it's a great honor to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, I share Chris's sentiment that experiential learning is, I think, critical to formation and development for an OD practitioner. Everything from who they are and how they show up in the world, all the way to how they can practice. And I think keeping with that is the willingness and the courage to go beyond what's conventional and explore innovation and creativity, look at the edge of conventional dynamics, to be willing to work in areas of more novel emergent patterns. This is something that's going to increasingly be in demand. And I think, again, this is why OD stays and is the only behavioral science role in the top 20 of the World Economic Forum's projection of career growth in the next decade or so. So it's an exciting time. I love that you're having this conversation. You keep these dialogues going, and also appreciate being here.
Well, thank you both. And we look forward to an opportunity of having this conversation extended with you again.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Edge of Leadership podcast series with Michael Molinaro and Greg Thompson. You can learn more about Michael and Greg at www.theedgeofleadership.com. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us for future episodes.